As English language teachers, we don't just teach the English language. We also teach the culture that goes with English language usage, be it Canadian culture, British culture, American culture, or Australian culture. In this video, you'll see a series of interviews with teachers talking about how they teach Canadian culture along with teaching the English language. And you'll hear their challenges with this task and just different things they've learned over the years as they've tried to help their students both learn the English language and also be successful in a Canadian cultural context.
Singularly, the most important thing, two things actually, to teach non-native speaker students about Canadian culture is that Canadian culture values individuality. And a lot of societies, culturally, academic culture as well as their social culture is collective. They come from a collective mindset. Whereas here we value, we nurture, we cherish our individuality. And that's a huge transition for non-native speaker students. So in the same line of thought, what is also important is, the second thing, is that in Canadian academic culture, we value critical thinking. Nothing is a given. We question things. So as a teacher, a non-native speaker teaching non-natives in a Canadian culture is to bring out in them that individuality and to push them towards critical thinking, so that they don't assume things. They don't, because I'm in the front of the class, you can question me. You can question and you can question me. And so those are the two things that I think are very significant that I can bring to the class as far as teaching them about Canadian culture. By example. How I teach it is I use comparative structures. I always, anytime I get an opportunity, I always bring in, how do you do it in your culture? How do you say this in your culture? What does this mean in your culture? How would you express this? What would you do in such and such a situation? Because when it's comparative, the student has something to fall back on. Always, my philosophy is always start with something they know and build onto something they don't know. And so I teach Canadian culture by comparing. So comparison. And that seems to work. It's quite effective, actually. It honors their culture, as well as show them the differences and similarities between the two cultures, their culture and the Canadian culture. Oh, that one, the biggest misconception. Well, there are a couple of them. One of them is the idea how lucky Canadian students are that they get to choose what they want to study. And what international students miss, and they come to realize, is the fact that with that freedom of choice comes a lot of responsibility. While they may not be given the choice, the freedom to choose what they want, so they're told they have to study business or they have to study whatever it is their parents want them to study, they also don't have the burden of earning money to study, right? Whereas Canadian kids, many of them have to work and study. So with that freedom of choice comes responsibility, and that's a misconception that international students very quickly realize that they have. The second one is that they will never change. When they come in, they have a cultural understanding of the language, they have a language understanding, but they don't realize the impact entering into another language will have on them. They don't realize the full extent of the change they will experience. Not bad change, just change. That they will change. That when you enter another language, you change culturally. You don't just change, oh, now I know a second language, whoop-de-doo. No. You actually change as a human being, because with that language come all the precepts, all the philosophies of that culture. And so it impacts them and they don't realize that. So those are two important factors, misconceptions that international students have when they come into the country, any country, English, our culture. Be honest, know yourself, be proud of your culture. At the same time, don't downplay the culture you're in. It's very important to know yourself. If you're a native speaker, you're a native speaker. It's easy in that you are part of that culture. You know the ins and outs. I was never educated in Canada, so I have no idea what the Canadian high school system is, for example. I've only seen it through my children who were so I don't have that idea, but I have to honor the fact that I am from where I am. So I would say to a teacher coming into the business is know yourself and understand your role when you're in front of the class. You are in front of this classroom, and you are, in a way, inadvertently or very knowingly representing Canadian culture. So if you have a clear identity of your own, see, identity becomes an issue. There are identity issues. There is an issue of where do I belong? And as a teacher, the added dynamic of being a teacher is another issue of identity as well. So it's important that a teacher standing in front, a non-native speaker teacher standing in front of an international classroom of students teaching English has a clear understanding of their own identity. And then it'll be okay. There will be no confusion. There'll be, it'll just be nice and clear sailing after that.
The most important things for teachers to teach their students about Canadian culture. Well, I think that it's important for teachers to know that they individually are not representative of Canadian culture. Right? I think that the teachers need to teach their students that Canadian culture is made up of a range of individuals from different cultural backgrounds, and that that's one of the greatest misconceptions I think that our students have, is that they come here and they see us as being representative of Canadian culture, and in fact we are not. We can introduce culture to them, cultural aspects to them, but we are not Canadian cultural representatives necessarily. So they have to keep that in mind, and I think teachers need to understand that. Well, in my classes, I don't teach it explicitly. It comes up through questions that students ask, and they tend to ask questions more frequently once you've established that relationship with them. Certainly, we here in this university context, we teach academic discourse culture, so university cultural aspects in North America, I guess, are things that we do teach explicitly, but all other things tend to come up in a sort of organic, natural way through students' questions, and I'll gladly answer them as long as they understand that whatever information I'm giving them it's coming from me, and I'm just one perspective. Like I mentioned earlier, I think that many of them need to understand that as a group, their instructors are not representative of Canadian culture. So once that misconception's out of the way, there's a few other things. I think many students come to Canada thinking that all Canadians are nice people, and that means they don't need to be wary, they can let down their guard because they're in a country full of nice people. And I've had some students be a little overly trusting of some people and get into a little bit of trouble. So I think that students need to understand that from the very beginning, just for their own survival and safety. I think that also many students, and I should say particularly our Asian students, often misread the nuance of our relationship as ESL teachers with them. It's a very friendly relationship, it's a nurturing one, and we tend to coddle them, I suppose, in a way, just to help to integrate them and make them feel comfortable for the early months here in Canada. So sometimes those actions are misread, and students might believe that, well, things are so easy here. The expectations are very low. This is an easy ride and we don't have to do anything. So that's one misconception as well. Just the misunderstanding of that dynamic, that caring dynamic. Right? It doesn't exempt them from performing and the expectations that we have for them. I think that, again, the instructors who are going to be teaching about Canadian culture need to understand that there's a range of perspectives, and that they do have a lot to offer their students, but at the same time, their students will probably look to them as being the authority on Canadian culture, and I think, again, that is a misconception that students have. So So teachers need to address that in any aspect of the culture that they attempt to teach.
Wow. Canadian culture is kind of a difficult and challenging thing to teach, but I always approach it from a very pragmatic or very practical perspective. So I teach students things about Canadian culture that will help them be successful interacting in Canadian culture. So if they want to, get a job in Canada, for example, I teach them the aspects of Canadian culture that will help them accomplish that. If they just want to, if they're just here for a short time and they just want to learn, meet Canadian people or learn things about Canada, then I give them information that's going to help them with that. So I always approach it from an objective perspective or a goal perspective. What's your goal for being here, and then what's going to help you be successful in meeting that goal. When I'm teaching Canadian culture, I use a lot of illustrations and scenarios, and I bring in as much authentic material as possible. So I share stories, I share challenges people have had in understanding Canadian culture, and then we talk about strategies for overcoming those challenges. So I take a very realistic perspective. Here are real stories and real situations, and then here are real ways that you can get through or navigate these challenges with Canadian culture. The biggest misconception I think that students have about Canadian culture, and a lot of teachers have this as well, is that there is no Canadian culture. People look at Canadian culture and they're like, well, that's no different than American culture or British culture and so on. And they really find it hard to identify what Canadian culture is. So then students say, well, there is no Canadian culture. In fact, there is. And the essence of Canadian culture is not on the surface level. So it's not a superficial distinction. So there's no, there are some Canadian foods and Canadian products and things like that, but they're just not as obvious as they are with other cultures. The essence of Canadian culture really is in the value system and the ideas that define Canadian culture. So whenever I get students who say, well, there is no Canadian culture or Canadian culture is no different from other English-speaking cultures, I'm like, hang on a second, yes it is, but it's buried a little bit deeper than you might think, and therefore it's just not as obvious. So advice I would give to a new teacher in terms of how to approach teaching Canadian culture is to really go beyond the superficial. So, don't teach Tim Hortons and maple syrup or maple sugar or, the fact that we wear toques in the winter and parkas and things like that. That's really the superficial piece of Canadian culture. I would really encourage new teachers to dig deeply and really understand the why. So here's what Canadians do in this situation, and then why do they do that? So I would really encourage them to dig into the beliefs and the ideas that define what Canadian culture is, because that's the part that students can't understand. Students are pretty quick to pick up that, Canadians like their Tim Hortons, for example, and Canadians like hockey. So spend your time on things or aspects of Canadian culture that students really can't pick up on their own.
Well, I don't think that you can separate language from culture. So knowing the language without knowing the culture would be learning in a void. So it's very, very important that the learner, the second language learner, feels that he or she is part of a culture and can learn the culture at the same time that they learn the language, because it's piece and part of the culture as well, right? Well, taking every single opportunity to refer back to Canadian culture, whatever it is, the way we do things, the things that we celebrate, the things that are common for us to do on a daily basis. Everything in the classroom can relate to Canadian culture. And also integrating the culture that the learner brings, exploring similarities and differences, and discovering that we are much more alike than we are different. That there is no Canadian culture. I think that that's the biggest misconception. And I think that many students from all over the world come here thinking that Canadian culture is very similar or almost equal to North American culture. So they expect to see the same that they have seen through movies or through media about the US. And then there is this sense of surprise and discovery that this is very different. be respectful of all the cultures in the classroom, because people are very sensitive, and sometimes because we don't know a lot about other cultures, we can easily get into the mistake of fighting other people's beliefs, or disregarding things that are important to them. So I think it's important a balance of integrating these people into the Canadian culture, but without losing sight of their own identity.
In my opinion, I think actually teaching them how people interact with each other is probably one of the most important things about culture that they have to learn. Well, of course, culture is a wide-ranging term, so there can be many ways you can teach it. I've done with my intermediate or upper intermediate students, for example, talking about Canadian food, famous people, politicians, sometimes even just discussing interesting Canadian law that gives a perspective onto Canadian culture. And then, of course, there are the traditional ways of using media of different types, video, music, television, newspaper. There are lots of ways that you can teach Canadian culture. The biggest misconception, that's a hard one, but I think that the thing that comes across to me most often is that people don't know well enough how to distinguish it between us, say, and the American culture. Or even that they think Canadian culture doesn't exist because we're in a multicultural nation, and that we're sort of a blend of all different places and people and backgrounds. Well, as I've said before, culture is a big word, and in fact, it's a very loaded word. It means something different to almost everybody that you meet. So I would probably suggest don't use the word in sort of its stereotypical way. Try and find out what the needs of the students that you have are, and teach it accordingly. For example, if you're teaching new immigrants who are going to be making their living here in Canada, their needs for Canadian culture will be quite different than if you are teaching an international student who is just here for the summer, or if you are in fact overseas as a Canadian teacher. I've had actually a lot of international students tell me, what do I need to know Canadian culture for? So that's something you have to keep in mind. The other suggestion I might have for teaching culture is, first of all, maybe talk about what culture means to the individual students in your class, to find out what stereotypes already exist, and then you can plan your lessons based on different topics that come out of that discussion.